Clint Eastwood walked into a saloon full of killers and walked out a legend. But Clint Eastwood's most chilling line? It wasn't said with a gun, it was whispered with a stare. Deserves got nothing to do with it. Join me till. End of this story, and subscribe my channel for more. It was raining when Will Money walked back into town, and it wasn't the kind of rain that cleansed. It was the kind that soaked into the bones, that whispered through wooden boards, that reminded every man in Big Whiskey that something unnatural had arrived inside the dimly lit saloon. The warm glow of lanterns flickered off whiskey glasses and nervous eyes. Blood still stained the floorboards where Money's friend, Ned Logan, had been displayed, tortured, mocked, and nailed to the wall like a warning. It wasn't justice, it wasn't law. It was cruelty disguised as order. Sheriff. Little Bill Daggett sat slumped in a chair, wounded and gasping for breath. He had ruled this town with swagger and steel. But now, his badge was just a piece of tin catching rainwater. And then the doors creaked open. Clint Eastwood, Will Money, stepped through the threshold like death with a shotgun. The silence was instant. Men froze, mugs paused midair. Chairs stopped rocking. The thunder outside couldn't drown out the sound of his boots on wood. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because this wasn't about fear anymore. This was about reckoning. Little Bill reached for his pistol. He could barely lift it. "I don't deserve this," he muttered, face pale, eyes wide. Money raised the barrel of his shotgun, his expression stone. And in a voice that cut cleaner than the gunfire that followed, he said, "Deserves got nothing to do with it." The blast tore through the silence. Little Bill's body crumpled. And just like that, the myth of the noble sheriff, the fair lawman, died. What stood in the saloon that night wasn't a hero. It was the ghost of every wrong the West had buried under grit and legend. It was Will Money, and he wasn't there for justice. He was there for truth. The smoke from the shotgun still curled in the air, hanging like a ghost above Little Bill's lifeless body. Every eye in the saloon was locked on Will Money, not because they thought they could stop him, but because they knew they couldn't. He didn't lower his weapon. He turned slowly, his long coat dripping rainwater, his eyes scanning the room, with the calm of a man who had already made peace with what he was. No panic, no apology, just cold certainty. "Any man I see with a gun," he said, his voice like gravel soaked in thunder, "I'm gonna kill him." Chairs scraped the floor as men pushed them away. The thugs who had laughed earlier, who'd helped torture Ned, who'd spit at his name, they weren't outlaws now. They were schoolboys caught cheating in church. Their hands rose slowly. Some dropped their pistols to the floor with trembling fingers. Money didn't flinch. He gestured toward the bar, where the owner cowered behind a half-filled bottle of bourbon. "You, barkeep." "You better bury Ned right," he growled. "I don't want to hear he got left for dogs. He was my friend." The barkeep nodded so hard his hat fell off. A horse outside neighed. Lightning flashed. And still Money stood in the center of it all, the eye of a storm that had finally reached Big Whiskey. But this wasn't just about Ned anymore. This was about truth, about how easily people called men bad to excuse their own cruelty, how the badge had become a weapon, and how justice in this town had always been who had the bigger gun. Now, that man was here. Money began to back toward the swinging doors, his shotgun still raised. Not a soul moved, not a whisper passed. He'd killed 5 men in less than a minute, and no one doubted he'd kill more. He stopped at the door and turned his head slightly. "You better bury them proper," he said low, "or I'll come back and kill every last one of you." Then he stepped out into the rain, and the silence he left behind was louder than any gunshot. The rain didn't let up. It poured like it was trying to wash the blood off the earth, but even the sky knew, some stains don't come out. Will Money rode out of Big Whiskey without looking back. His horse trudged through the mud, hooves heavy with the weight of the man it carried. Money didn't care. He was soaked through. His hat dripped. His coat clung to his back like guilt. Behind him, the saloon faded into the darkness, but the silence. Didn't it followed him? Loud, accusing, familiar. He had killed again, not for money, not for fame, but for Ned and maybe a part of himself he'd buried a long time ago, years earlier. He had made a promise to his wife, now long buried in the cold Wyoming dirt. He swore off killing, off drinking, off being the monster people. Once feared, she saw something good in him, something he tried so hard to protect, but Big Whiskey had called that promise a lie. They'd beaten Ned, tortured him, displayed his body like a warning to other men. They thought Will Money was dead and buried alongside the mercy he'd once tried to live by. They were wrong. Lightning flashed again. The horse neighed, uneasy. Money gritted his teeth. He remembered the screams, the begging, the way Little Bill had looked up at him in disbelief, as if he was the victim, as if justice hadn't just been shoved down his throat in the form of a shotgun blast. Munny had always believed in one thing: the world doesn't give you what you deserve. It gives you what it wants. And tonight, the world had wanted retribution. He wasn't proud of it. He wasn't ashamed either, because deep in the marrow of his bones, Will Money knew he hadn't changed. He'd only been sleeping. And Big Whiskey had been foolish enough to wake him. He looked up at the black sky, the rain stinging his face, and for a moment it was like he could feel her, his wife, watching, not judging. Just knowing he didn't whisper her name, he didn't say a prayer, he just rode, because when you've been what he's been, when you've done what he's done, you stop asking for forgiveness. You just make sure they never forget your name. The storm began to break by the time Will Money reached the edge of his land. The rain faded into mist, and the sky opened just enough to let through slivers of pale dawn light. But there was no sunrise in his heart, only the weight of silence and soaked saddle leather. His horse slowed near the fence line, crooked, leaning the same fence he'd built with Ned one summer long ago, before time turned its back on both of them. There were no welcoming voices, no warm fire waiting inside, just the creak of old wood and the wind curling through the trees like a whisper of judgment. And then the door opened. Two children stood in the frame, his son taller now than he remembered, his daughter barefoot, holding a lantern. Their eyes locked on him like they were unsure if he was really there or if a ghost had returned. Soaked in blood and rain, Money didn't speak. He dismounted slowly, his legs stiff, his soul heavier than the mud caked on his boots. The shotgun remained strapped to his back like it knew it hadn't heard its last breath yet. The boy stepped forward. "Did you find him?" Money nodded once. "Ned's gone. They made him suffer." The boy looked away. He already knew. Will looked down at his hands. Even though he'd wiped the blood off, it felt like it was still there, in the cracks of his knuckles, under his fingernails, in the spaces between memory and regret. "Did you kill them?" The boy asked quieter. Money didn't lie. "Yes." There was no sermon, no explanation, because there comes a point in a man's life when words aren't enough to rewrite what he's done. He stepped into the house, and the familiar creak of the floorboard greeted him like a scar you forgot you had. The kid sat down. He poured water in a basin, washing his face slowly, methodically, but the eyes in the mirror didn't change. Still hollow, still hard. Still haunted. Later that night, as the children slept, Money sat alone by the window. A shotgun leaned against the wall beside him. Not out of paranoia, out of habit, he stared into the dark woods, thinking of Little Bill's last words, of how the man said he didn't deserve it. Deserve's got nothing to do with it. Maybe he'd been talking to Will. Maybe Will had been answering himself. Because when you're the man who brings death, even if it's for the right reason, you stop asking the world what you're owed. You just take what's left and try to live with it. Weeks passed. Big Whiskey tried to clean the blood from its floorboards, bury its dead, and pretend life would go back to normal. But it never did, because Will Money had ridden through it. And towns don't forget the day the devil wore a wide-brimmed hat and didn't ask for permission. At first, the whispers were quiet, saloon stories, campfire mutterings. No one dared say his name too loud, like it might summon him back. They called him the farmer with a gun, the dead-eyed drifter. Some said he killed 10 men that night. Others said he didn't fire a second shot because he didn't need to. The truth was simpler. Will Money was just a man, but the West doesn't tell stories about men. It tells stories about monsters, about ghosts, about men who kill and vanish, leaving behind the kind of silence no preacher can explain. Word reached the territories fast. A man in Dodge claimed to have seen Money ride through under moonlight, rifle slung low, eyes like stone. A child in Cheyenne swore her uncle met Money once, and said he didn't blink the entire conversation. People started leaving drinks on grave markers, muttering prayers they didn't understand, but back on his farm, well, Money didn't know any of that. He didn't care to. His world had shrunk to chores, crops, and raising 2 children without ever letting them see the man he truly was. The man who once drank whiskey straight from the bottle. The man who shot a lawman in the face and didn't flinch. Still, every so often when the sky turned storm gray and the wind howled low, he'd walk to the edge of the property, rest a hand on the fence post, and stare down the empty road. Waiting not for someone to come, but for the day when what he did would ride back to find him, because legends don't die when the man retires. They grow teeth. They change shape. They haunt the next man who thinks wearing a badge makes him untouchable. And in big whiskey, they still say it, low and only after dark. Deserves got nothing to do with it. Years passed, but the memory didn't fade. It deepened like a scar. Will Money never returned to big whiskey. He never had to. The town had learned its lesson. Not from a sermon, not from a law book, but from the long shadow one man left behind. He never pulled a trigger again. Never touched whiskey again, but he never found peace either. Some men carry their past like a wound that scabs over but never heals. And Money was one of them. His children grew up without ever fully understanding what their father had done, or why he rarely spoke of the past. They just knew there were days he stared at the horizon too long, nights he paced. Mornings he didn't sleep. And still, the stories grew. He became folklore. A warning whispered to young gunslingers eager for fame. Don't chase blood unless you're ready to drown in it. That's what they'd say. And then they'd name the one man who proved it. Will Money, but stories lie. They say he was a monster. That he liked it. They don't tell you he wept the night Ned died. That he stood over his grave with a hand on his chest, whispering his friend's name like an apology. They don't tell you he once believed love could change him, and for a time it did. But the West doesn't allow men to rest. It remembers them not as they lived, but as they killed. And Money? He killed with the silence of a storm, without joy, without pause, without mercy, because in the end, as he once said, deserves got nothing to do with it. So the man faded, but the myth? The myth rode on. And it still does, through dust trails and empty saloons, across dry fields where no grass grows. A legend not born from glory, but from the truth that the West never wanted to admit. Sometimes the only justice is the one you become yourself.